Okay, perfect. All right, y'all. So, want to kind of just like preface this whole thing with like, what we're here to do, right? In last class, we were talking a lot about full stack stuff, right? What does it mean to work in a full stack? What does it mean to kind of work on client side and server side stuff? And so as a reminder, like being in full stack kind of means that you're going to commit to working on the front end and working on the back end. So we talked a lot about the whole process of what's going on behind the scenes and clients talking to servers using HTTP and all of that kind of good stuff. And then this right here is just like a simple full stack application. It might not look that crazy complicated. It looks kind of maybe just like a little to-do list or something. And that is really what it's doing on the front end. But all this information that's coming back onto this list in the front end is coming from a server that I have running in the back end. And that's kind of cool, right? It's like, you can have servers that are hosting your own set of data, and what your front end application or the thing that the user is seeing, the client side of your application, is something visible that's displaying that data, giving the client something to interact with. But at the end of the day, still interacting with another computer by way of the server and by way of certain requests that are being made. I can show y'all some of the code real quick. Let me see if I could just switch screens. Yeah, it might look like crazy, but some of what you can expect that we'll talk about in this class is like, React and the process of creating components in React. So I built some components here. I kind of just repurposed an old app real quick that I had to kind of serve the purpose of what we're talking about here. So before, what this app was doing was listing different customers that were coming back from a file that I created here that was pulling that data from a specific API. So the API is like a link that we're creating to talk to another application. And that application is my server, which is defined here in this other file called server.js, which has a whole kind of server running on port 5000. That also, not only is it serving the purpose of providing back that data in this route called customers, that was originally the customers route. It also is responsible for hosting my React application as well. So my React application is also being hosted on this server, which is why when I go to, let me see, when I go back to here, right, everything's kind of happening from localhost 5000. And so what does all this mean? Is like, it's like, okay, like this is interesting. Like you show me a website, that's kind of cool. Like, but at the end of the day, what does this all mean? Especially if I'm just now getting started with JavaScript, all of that could have been mad confusing. But I'm showing you this to say that this is what we're really here to do. Being a full stack developer, being someone learning JavaScript from the beginning, it's like the purpose here is to really get in your bag and like, and learn how to use JavaScript to do a lot of different things. So there's steps to this, and in this particular set of series of topics that we'll be talking about, first thing we're going to want to do is learn some JavaScript, of course. Next thing we're going to do is learn some React. And then, lastly, how to get the bag doing this. So what more do we need in order to go from learning React to like learning how to get the bag? And there's mad stuff to that, right? There's more than just the React piece that is important. There's all types of other nuanced things in JavaScript land that you got to continue to learn in order to reinforce your skills and to get to a point where, like things make more sense. So if that makes sense, just drop a thumbs up real quick. You know what I'm saying? So I know you rock with me and we can keep it pushing. All right, lit. Appreciate y'all. Dope. Cool. Gucci. All right, bet. So today we are going to go from the beginning, from the very beginning. How do you start working with JavaScript? How do you kind of get into a place where now you can start building these types of applications and, learning the different nuanced things in JavaScript that you might need for your career, for yourself, or to make impact, because that's a cool thing about being in full stack stuff too, is you can make a lot of impact building these types of applications. So first thing you need to do if you are interested in using JavaScript in general is you need to download Node onto your machine. what is Node? Node is is basically the runtime environment for JavaScript. So you can think of it like in Java land, you know, y'all got the y'all have like different set of systems that compile code, right? In Java and in like C++, and you have compilers and things like that. There's no real compiler for JavaScript, but in order to run JavaScript, you need a JavaScript engine and you need an environment for running JavaScript. And one of the most interesting things about JavaScript is that on your browser, there's built-in runtime environments for JavaScript in your browser. So every web browser has this built in. Matter of fact, when we were taking a look at the Google Chrome developer tools and the inspector, right, we saw like, oh, there's like this console thing that you can use to kind of mess around with certain JavaScript elements and kind of get some things kind of performing here. And your console is built to run JavaScript. Your browsers are built to run JavaScript. You could turn it off. You could turn off JavaScript on your browsers by changing some settings. And that's actually a really interesting exercise to see what breaks, what breaks when you turn off JavaScript on your browser. So maybe we could play around with that in a bit. But in order to start writing JavaScript of your own, you need to download Node. And it's very simple. You can go to nodejs.org to download it. They have installers for Windows, for Mac, and I'm sure they have some for Linux. Yeah, they have some for Linux here. So depending on what your machine's OS is, just go ahead and download the latest version of Node. The best thing for you to do is to download the last stable version. So whatever it says here for the LTS is probably the best one for you to download because this one is the most tested and has kind of more stability. Current is like for folks who are doing like more experimental JavaScript development and want the like most up to date. But you know, with things that are most up to date, there's always different little bugs that need to be worked through. So this one is the version that's most suitable for people who are just trying to develop, especially in professional context, because it's tested and ready to go. So yeah, take a second and download JavaScript, download Node, onto your machine. And what it should do is it should like pull up a window for installation. I already have it installed on my Mac. And so if some of y'all might already have it installed, but for those of y'all who don't, just go ahead and click this and just install it. And what it'll do is ask for you to save it onto your machine. And you can test that you have it running. You can test that you have Node fully installed on your machine by opening up like a command line tool. So whether you're on Mac using your terminal or whether you're on Windows using the command prompt, or like on Linux using a command line or whatnot, you can just open up that like terminal window and you should be able to run the command node -- version and get some version back. Right now I'm on version 17.4, but for the purposes of the class or the course, whatever the latest stable version is cool for y'all to have access to. Go ahead if you have a question.
I have a question, Professor. I'm trying to install it, and it says something about like some packages. Say some npm modules needed to be compiled from C++ when installed. If you want to be able to install such modules, some tools like Python or Visual Tool need to be installed. So should I allow to install that too?
Whatever it recommends you to install, I would say yes on your machine. But if it's like asking you to do extra stuff, you don't need to do the extra stuff. So just do whatever it says like already has as the default, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because this say like optional. So
yeah. I would just do the bare minimum stuff that is allowed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
No, good question. Go ahead, Angela.
So is this like an app? Because I already installed it and then it just disappeared. Nothing happened. Like I ran the terminal line and I got back the version, but I can't find it anywhere.
Yeah. It's a command line. It's a package on your command line in your operating system. So it downloads some binary code that's put into your like download some source code, that's put into your machine. in a specific folder in your on your machine. So it's not like an application that you're going to click on and like interact with OD. It's more of something that you're going to interact with via the command line in the terminal.
Got you. All right, thank you.
Yep, great question. Yeah, go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, so I downloaded VS Code, and for my last class, I was writing some JavaScript in it. Like, what's the difference between that and downloading this Node.js?
You probably had to download Node to run the JavaScript in that class, because there's probably no other way that you were running that JavaScript unless you were using it on a browser or something. Okay, well, I guess I'll do you already have Node installed? Like, did you check? I don't know. I just know I got VS Code and it works. I'll check. Wait. I would check the terminal. So open the terminal and do the node dash version to make sure that you have that you can actually hit what? Node dash version or node dash v. I think both of those should work. Not found. Right. So then you should go and install Node. So you should, do what I just said to do. Install the job.
Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the npm is like the pip to install the packages?
Yeah, it's a package manager. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Yep. Okay. Edgardo, go ahead, bro.
Yeah, so I downloaded in Visual Studio Code already, and I downloaded it through the marketplace in Visual Studio Code. So am I good or no?
If you ran node dash version and it worked, then you're good. If you run node dash version and don't work, you're not good.
All right, I'm gonna check right now just to make sure.
Yeah, I bet. All right, cool. Yeah, my recommendation is that you do what I say, download it. But you know what I'm saying? It's up to y'all whether y'all take that recommendation or not. But I highly recommend 10 out of 10 recommend you download Node to get started in JavaScript. You're gonna appreciate yourself for doing that. You're gonna give yourself a pat on the back for that one. Quick show of hands, how many of y'all got it download already? And we can keep it pushing. All right, cool. Right there. I see you. I got you. Appreciate that. That's what's up. Cool. Word. And like, yeah, if there's issues, let's save it for after class and I'll feel free to troubleshoot it. But for right now, let's just keep it pushing so we can get to the good part. Dope. So all right, we're kind of lit. We're on our way. Downloading Node is the first important step to running JavaScript on your own. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a quick second. The next thing we need is some type of a text editor. So most of y'all probably have something on your computer that you use as a text editor. Atom, Eclipse, you could use, like all types of different stuff that I know that folks write in. If you use like built-in terminal-based command line text editors, command line editors, you can use those. But for the most part, especially in the web dev space, one of the most helpful and like, I guess, widely popular tools that we use for writing all of our code is Visual Studio. And Visual Studio Code is an application that you can use to basically write your code and use that application to also easily do other things with the code, like running it, adding like extensions, all types of stuff. So I personally use Visual Studio Code. And so for the purpose of like the class and like just these types of sessions and stuff, you're going to see me using Visual Studio Code often. But, it's up to you whether you choose to use VS Code or whether you use something different. But I recommend it. I used to use a different editor called Sublime Text for a long time. But yeah, my life changed when I started using VS Code. My homies, it was like, that debate where people were like, oh, like you Android versus iPhone. And I'm out here like, so I still got it. Like, you should let me do my thing, But we good out here with VS Code. So there's no like, there's not like, it's like one of those things that's developer preference. So if you have an editor that you like already, that's cool. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's going to sweat you for one or the other. But if you don't have a preference and you're open to trying it, I would say VS Code is cool. And there's some really great features that it has. Atom is cool too, like Boris said in the chat. That's definitely true. But yeah, so I'll take a second. Make sure that you have an editor installed. If you have Atom, that's cool. If you have something else, that's cool. But for me, I'll be using VS Code. If you want to choose to use VS Code with me, go ahead and just download that as well. And yeah, go ahead, Andre.
Oh my bad, I didn't take my hands down.
Oh, you good, bro? You good, bro? Cool. Yeah, you could just download the Mac universal build. Yeah, they got one for Windows and they got one for Linux as well. Dope. So yeah, that should this is an application. This is a this is creating this is going to install an actual application on your computer that you should be able to see on in your application folder, and you should be able to click and open that on your own using your own like icon for that installation. And cool. Go ahead, Escardo.
Yeah, you told me to check it by saying what VS dash.
You want to check node. You want to do node dash version.
No space, right?
Oh, no, you do want a space there, brother. I don't know where you're referring to the space. There's a space. There's a space in there after node.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So node, then space, then dash.
Version. Yep.
Gotcha.
Thanks. Appreciate y'all hopping in the chat, helping your colleagues. Cool. So basically, now that you have Node installed and now that you have some type of text editor, you're good to go. So just quick show of hands. How many folks are kind of, we good right here? Keep throwing a thumb up. That's cool. Show of hands. That's also cool. Appreciate y'all. All right, lit. Dope. Groovy. All right, y'all. Look at y'all. You know, coming along. My little web devs coming along out here. See y'all. All right, cool. Dope. So this is where all the cool stuff kind of comes up now. Like we can focus on like the actual parts of stuff that we care about. So let's get into this. So what I'm gonna do is switch my screen over to, let's see. I'm gonna just pull up my desktop for now. And what I'll say is, so basically what we want to do now is start the process of writing out some JavaScript, right? And so in order to do that, I'm going to use VS Code. Like I said, you can use whatever editor you want. I'm going to close this because I don't need this anymore. But open up a new VS Code window or open up a new window in your text editor of choice. And if you're using VS Code, you know, if this is your first time using VS Code or using a text editor, it's pretty simple. All of them should be relatively straightforward, but the whole idea is that you want to use this program to create new files, and also you can create folders for new projects as well, right? So here on VS Code, my workflow, I like to create folders because it makes it easier to deal with projects that way. So what I'm gonna do is start a new project, and I can do that by opening the folder or add a folder in VS Code. So what I'm going to do first is just click open folder, and then just make one for this project. So let's see. Right, so I'll make a new folder here, and I'm gonna say learning JavaScript. Dope. So I got a new folder. I'm gonna open that, John, and the VS Code window should switch up to having that folder opened, and right now there's no files in there. So I can add a new file to use to start working. There's a couple ways to do that in VS Code. So what I'm gonna just do is open a new file using this icon here and starting a new file for myself. So the file I'm gonna create, and this is what y'all would wanna do if you're gonna follow along right here, is create a file. You can call it main.js. You can really call it anything .js, but for me, I'm just gonna call it main.js. One thing I really like about VS Code and other editors that are kind of newer is that based on the file extension, it'll give you kind of a preview of like, oh, like this file is a JavaScript file, right? Which is really helpful because when you're working with a big project, you can see which files are the ones that are using JavaScript, what other languages are these other files using, and it makes things really helpful. Also, so just kind of for VS Code, and this is not me trying to plug VS Code or nothing, but I really do like this application. On the bottom here is the language detection. So you can actually change the language. Or say that you did type this and it didn't know what particular language this was using. You could switch that out here to make sure that you have the correct language there. So clearly VS Code you can use for all types of different languages. And that's what makes it very helpful for developers, is because you can use this one text editor to write in a bunch of different languages. So all you got to do right now is whatever editor you're using, make sure you open up a new file called main.js somewhere in your on your computer. And dope. Just kind of show with thumbs, just to kind of make sure folks are kind of right there with me. Cool, cool, cool. All right. Dope. Dope. Okay, cool. Dope. All right, bet. So now that you have this file opened, we just created our first JavaScript file. And JavaScript is all JavaScript files end with a .js at the end. And that's really all that there is to create a JavaScript file. It's that simple. So what you're gonna want to do here in this JavaScript file, first thing you're gonna want to do to pat yourself on the back, make sure that everything working the right way. We're gonna type in console.log, open some parentheses, and inside of those parentheses, you can put some type of a message for yourself. You know what I mean? Like I'm gonna just say we lit, learning JavaScript like a pro. Right? And then you want to just save that on the file. So I use Command S on the Mac as a shortcut, but save your file and make sure that you just add some type of a message in there. And we'll talk about what this is doing in a second. I'm sure you can probably guess what's going to happen next. Yeah, so the next step here is, after we have created this file, right, main.js, after we've written our console log message in that file, main.js, the next thing you're going to want to do is run this, right, and test this out in JavaScript. And so there's a couple of ways to do this depending on the type of system that or type of editor you're using. One of the other reasons why I love VS Code is because it has a built-in terminal feature. So you can really quickly open a new terminal in VS Code by clicking terminal and new terminal, and it should pop up a little terminal on the bottom. So the terminal is my command line, right? So rather than have 3 apps open, I could just use this one. I could just use VS Code to do all the stuff that I need to do to run my JavaScript, which is really helpful. That's probably the main reason why I like using VS Code, is this integrated terminal setup, and also the extensions that they have are really cool. Whether you're using a different editor or you don't, whatever your situation is, you're going to want to open up a terminal window, command line window. And depending on how you're set up, you're going to want to make sure that you find that particular folder or wherever you save this main.js file, right? So again, you're doing this all in VS Code, made this really easy for me. I'm already in that folder. That is the same folder where I saved this file. I can confirm that by just typing ls, which is a command line to command to just list out all the files inside of my current folder. So this is confirming that this main.js is in here, that I'm in the right place. So you're gonna want to make sure you're in the right place. That's the first thing. So if you're in a different terminal or you didn't use an app like VS Code or Atom that has those things built in, you're gonna want to make sure you navigate to the folder that you save that file in, so that you can run the command node space and then the name of the file. So in my case, it's main.js, but whatever your file name is, however you named your file, just switch this to be the name of that file. And then you can press enter and you should get your message popping up in the console. You can, like, lift your hands up like you did something, look smug, like you're about to make, like you're about to make the best app in the world. You know what I'm saying? Do a couple head nods and you lit, you know what I'm saying? And you just entered the world of JavaScript programming with that simple 2 clicks, you know what I'm saying? Props to y'all, right? So if that worked for you, just throw a thumb up in the chat so I know, or like just drop a thumb react so I know that we good. If you're still working on it or experiencing trouble, feel free to drop in the chat that that's the case, and maybe some folks can add some troubleshooting tips and help out. But I'm also down to do that after the little lesson. All right, cool, word. So we wrote our first line of JavaScript, which is dope. And it's a very important line. It's the console.log, right? So this is our first look at a function in JavaScript, right? And for those of y'all who have programming experience before, functions are essentially blocks of code that we can assign to like some type of a name that we can call, and it will run specific code for us whenever we call it, right? So console.log is a function that is built into JavaScript. It makes use of the console object, which is also kind of a built-in, it's a built-in object in JavaScript that we can reference that basically allows us to write output or log output to the JavaScript console. So the reason we needed Node to run this file is because Node acts like an engine and creates a JavaScript console for us to work with. And whenever like it sees something like console.log, it knows to put that on the terminal as output for us to see there, right? If we were running this in an actual web browser, this console.log would show up inside of our web browser in that console that we see when we go into Google Chrome, right? So this console that comes back in the Chrome developer tools, that's what that console is referring to. Whatever is responsible for running the JavaScript and outputting that stuff is what we call the console. So when we use Node in the command line, it's going to be here on our output in the terminal. But when we're on a browser and we're actually looking at our website for real, and that website is using JavaScript, any console messages will come up in that console in the Google Chrome developer tools. So that's just helpful to know, right? So console.log is the equivalent of a print function. So this is how you print output to the terminal. So I'm just gonna write a little comment up here. Print to the console using console.log, right? And so that function is really helpful, right? We use this pretty often because logging output is really important. And then for those of y'all who are familiar, here's how you write comments or single line comments in JavaScript is with the double slashes. And then if you wanted to leave a multi-line comment, you can open it like this and close it like that. And this is an example of a multi-line comment. Right. So comments are helpful because they let us kind of mock up our code with the things that we want other people to know. So every so often you might see in my code or in other people's code comments that they're leaving. And so this is just how you leave comments in JavaScript. Quick hack, just to know, in VS Code is really easy to, or in most text editors, it's really easy to kind of toggle things between comments and stuff. I think on Mac, you can use command with the / and that will kind of trigger the comment. And on a Windows, I think if you hold Control and do the same thing, it should do the same thing for you. So just heads up for simplicity's sake. Cool. So this is our first bit of JavaScript. just kind of getting the console to print. So what we're going to want to do now is kind of play around, hack around with some more JavaScript concepts and learn some of the basics, and use Node to run this file to kind of make sure that things are running as we would expect, right? So I'm just going to clear my terminal output right quick so it's not confusing. And we're just going to kind of take it from the beginning. So most important stuff that you're going to need to know with any programming language is, right, variables, right? And in JavaScript, there's a number of different ways that you can assign something to a variable. So there's a couple types of variables that you can work with. I'm going to kind of save y'all the details of like, okay, here's like I'm going to try to make it as relevant to like what's currently being used as possible. But I want y'all to know all that there is so that if you're looking at older code, you kind of know what's up. So in JavaScript, there's 3 ways you can define a variable. You can use the var keyword, and I'm going to just use, say, var x. You can set that equal to a number. So this is one way, easy way to set a variable, right? Another way to set a variable is using the let keyword. And the let keyword also allows you to assign a variable. So there's var and there's let. And then the last one that you need to know is const, which is another way to assign a variable, but it's slightly different. So what are the differences between these 3 things? So a var is just kind of the default variable assign keyword. It was the oldest keyword in JavaScript. So previously in Dragon Ball Z, everyone was using the var keyword, you know what I'm saying? Because it was just the easiest one. That was the one that we had. But recently in later JavaScript, like kind of more modern updates to JavaScript, people started using the let keyword versus the var keyword. And the difference between the let and the var is related to like the scope of where these variables are able to be seen from. So var by default was creating global variables, which basically means that anywhere in this file, so long as I declared this, someone could make reference to this variable, which is cool. But you know, sometimes that can get tricky when you don't remember, like, oh, I set this variable called X up here, and then later, mad lines later, you know, you want to do something different. So in order to fix that and make it so that there was more kind of consistency with how variables were able to be defined and where their scope was, everybody was recommended to move over to using the let keyword in JavaScript. So for the most part, if you want to create a simple variable, just remember that we use the let keyword. And let does the same thing as the var keyword and letting you just create a variable, except this variable isn't global by default. It's global in the scope that it was created in. And that means that, you know, if ever this was declared inside of a function, it would only exist inside that function. But if this was declared outside of a function, you know, anything outside of that could also could use it. So that might make more sense in the long term. But the const keyword is a little different. This lets us create a constant variable. So this is creating a variable where the value isn't able to be changed. So you know, the benefit of having a variable is now that I have a variable, I can, you know, run different types of expressions with those variables. So here I'm assigning this variable called y to get a value of 10. And I realize that this might be a little small. I just realized for y'all to see. But set myself back up. So yeah, so we're setting this variable y to get the value of 10, right? So single equals is the expression assignment operator in JavaScript. And we use this to assign something to a variable, right? And the biggest difference between a let and a const is, whereas in this like let situation, right, I could do something like console.log y, and let me just comment this one out, and then back in the terminal, I can just say node main.js one more time, and oh, I didn't save this, that's my bad. So if I run this one more time, oops, right, got 10 coming back. So 10 is the Y that I was set right here. So clearly this is there, right? So if I was to change, if I was to try to change this, right, I can reassign that variable by saying like Y gets 20 or something, right? And in console login that again, we can see that it got changed, right? So let variables are able to be changed, right? But if we did the same thing with Z, right? So instead changing this value for Z, clearly, you know, I can, let's just console log Z now, just for sake of clarity. Right, I get my first error, right? And this error basically, when you scroll back up, no, that's kind of a little hard to see, but this error basically says, hey, at line 16 in this main.js file, there was an error. We encountered an error here where Z is getting set to 20. So the errors in JavaScript are helpful. They'll point to the right line that's telling you something that came up. And the error that we got was called a type error. We're assigning to a constant variable, right? So you're gonna want to make sure that if you do get an error, to just take a look at what it's saying. Like, it's gonna give you a hint at what's the issue. And so here, basically it's saying we can't assign to a constant variable, which means exactly what I was saying, that constant values are fixed. So if you want a variable to be fixed and not change over time, you might want to use the const keyword versus the let keyword. And that's the basic difference between those two. Does that make sense? Just give me a show of thumbs if that makes sense. Just kind of, I'm just trying to rock with y'all real quick. Dope. All right, lit. Dope. Cool. So, you know, I am kind of working under the assumption that, you know, maybe this is your first time diving into programming and stuff. So I'm not trying to go too quick, but variables are mad important. We use them to assign value to things. So that's the main takeaway here. There's 3 ways to use to assign variables in JavaScript, but the 2 most important ones that you're going to see a lot of are the let and const keywords. And the only difference between the const keyword is and the let keyword is that the const doesn't change. Any value that's made as a constant doesn't get changed. You might be wondering, if you're like a Java person, oh, you're not using semicolons, what's going on? Ain't that necessary? And no, it's not necessary in JavaScript to use semicolons. So sometimes I'd be putting them just by like force of habit because of being taught C++ as a first language. But even when I, you know, my compiler, my VS Code editor has some extensions on it that help me clean up my files every time I press save. And, you know, it's funny because those files end up taking away those semicolons, even if I put them. So I'm like, okay, I just won't use them. Thank you. I'll remember that. So yeah, we just kind of talked about variables. Dope. So let me just get rid of this console log so we're not seeing any random stuff here. I'm going to just comment that out. And Liddy, we're making some cool progress here. So variables are important. And in JavaScript, you might now be wondering, okay, well, what are the different data types that I can use, right? We just saw an example of using numbers. And so what are the different data types that JavaScript has access to? Well, clearly we have numbers like we just saw in the form of integers. So all of these were integers in the sense that they had no decimal points. But we got a couple different types of numbers you can use in JavaScript. You can use ints, you can use floats, you can use as numbers. We have strings and Boolean values. So everything that you're probably used to from any other programming language you can use in JavaScript. So let's just take a look at some of those. The ints and the floats, I'm just gonna move this section down. With the ints and the floats, you know, clearly these are integers, right? So whole numbers that don't have any decimal points. We could really easily make them negative numbers if we wanted to do that, just by adding the minus sign in front of them. Yeah, very simple in JavaScript. if I wanted to make a floating point number, also very simple, you know what I'm saying? Just add a decimal point, and now that value is logged this way. In JavaScript, another thing you might be noticing is, well, hey, you're just calling y as an object, as like a number, and then like you're changing this over and over again, right? But don't you have to kind of say like let int y, or like, you know, let like float, you know, y, or whatever? But the thing about JavaScript that makes it kind of interesting is that it is not a strongly typed language by default. So there's, you know, TypeScript is a newer version of JavaScript that adds on that layer of strongly typing values. But regular JavaScript as a default is not typed. So everything kind of is referenced as an object. And like for numbers in this case, you know, just you can change this very easily by just editing the value that this object y has as a value assigned to it. So numbers, and you know, with numbers come all of that awesome territory of mathematical like expressions. So, you know, you could do your y plus z's, you know what I'm saying? You could do your y plus z expressions. You could do your, you know, let's do like y minus z, you know what I'm saying? And then like you could do like your mathematical stuff. So all of those things are still possible in JavaScript. Let me just make sure I don't have no errors in here. Oops, did this backwards. Right, so all these things still possible in working with numbers. So that is that. And yeah, so then beyond numbers, right? Another most important data type that you might be familiar with and might want to be a little curious about in JavaScript are strings, right? So in JavaScript land, you can really easily create a string by setting a variable equal to some length of characters that are wrapped with either double quotation marks or single quotation marks. In JavaScript, there's no preference over double or single quotation marks. Except for the fact that if I was gonna write write something that needed that single quotation mark, I would want to wrap it in double quotes first. So I'll show you that in a second. So I'm gonna say Cam as my first name, and then write a new message and say, ain't loving these quotation marks, right? So clearly ain't got a little quotation mark, like the single quote in there, right? So in order for this string to be valid and not cause any errors, I had to wrap it in double quotes, and that's what I meant. So if you internally need the single quote, you're gonna need to wrap it in double quotes. So that's just kind of where there's a preference, but either way, you know, I could wrap this first name with single quotes and it'll work fine. And so just like before, and just like you might be used to, you can use expressions also in with strings, right? So here's me just adding, making a little message using those strings. So I'm console logging my first name. So print this, then I said plus, and this is an empty string with a space inside of it. So there's a little space. And then I said print message, which is this, this here. So the hope is that what happens now, cool, just clear the console one more time, is that why didn't it print? Oh, did I save? Nope. There you go. And the message is printed. So all those string-based mathematical operations that you're used to of what we call string concatenation is possible in JavaScript. You can add values using strings. Just as you might be used to with any other languages, strings are represented the same way as you might expect them to be in different languages, where this is an array of characters. So you can reference the individual character by way of using array syntax, right? So if I do something like console.log first name bracket 0 plus I'll just do that just for the sake of showing y'all. Right, so I can get back that character by using array syntax. And we'll talk about arrays in a little bit, but just wanted to let you know that strings in JavaScript are able to be processed about the same way. So we use strings clearly for text, numbers for numbers, and then Booleans, right? Boolean values are also important to know in JavaScript. And in JavaScript, we got access to using true and false. So if I want to set a value in JavaScript, I can say, let class over and set that equal to false to start with, right? Because it's not over. And clearly, you know what I'm saying, I can check the output of that particular variable the same way I have been with the console logs and get back those particular values, right? So false and true are the two values that we got there. So that's just a little breakdown on the data types that we have. We got numbers in the form of, we have numbers, and you know, in JavaScript, all numbers are reflected as a number object. So like if you hovered over this Y, you see how it says it's a number. Like they don't it's not like it's gonna know it's an int or know it's a float. It just knows it's a number. So JavaScript numbers are kind of the data type that you would see. Strings are for messages, and we use those to kind of, you know, process text-based input. And Boolean values are true and false that we use for that kind of work as well. Cool, so I'll pause real quick. Any questions, or if not, if you just give me a quick show of thumbs so I know that we kind of good on this piece. Nice. Dope. Cool. Yeah. And if if you're looking for more practice, I definitely think the Codecademy is a good resource. So for those of y'all who have started it and said that you started it, kudos to y'all. This is probably just a recap of some of the stuff you saw. All right, lit. So last couple stuff I want to do for just kind of this really beginner walkthrough of JavaScript. We talked about the data types. We talked about comments. We talked about printing using console logs, right? Next, you kind of want to learn more about these expressions, right? And so next big thing probably to talk about when it comes to Booleans is conditionals, like conditional statements, right? So a conditional statement is typically like a statement that something happens based on a Boolean condition. This is actually really important when it comes to like, we use conditional statements a lot in React when we start programming in React, because you know, on the website, there's all types of different conditional things that can happen, right? It's the user's hovering over this, or the user's clicking on this, or is the user logged in, right? Those things might change. Those things might change what a user is able to interact with at any given point in time, right? So conditional statements, if else's are pretty simple in JavaScript. The if and if else kind of block kind of looks like this, where you say if, and then you can have your condition. We put them in parentheses, and then you can open set of brackets. The brackets define the scope. So earlier I was talking about how constants and lets, you know, those like the idea of scopes. So anything inside of brackets in JavaScript, this is just something you want to remember. Anything with brackets has its own scope. So there's a scope inside of this if statement, meaning if I define a variable here and I say, let, it'd be so funny, like trying to come up with variable names on the spot. But let's say like, I say like, right? And I can say like, I create this value called like is valid or something, right? here I might set that and I could say true, right? And then if I tried to console log is valid, right? Based on just kind of what we've learned so far, you might expect that this is gonna run and work. But when you run this code, it's gonna tell you, hey, oh, my fault. This is breaking because of this, something random. Let's say if class over equals true. Word. So let me just rerun that so that we're not getting mixed up. Right. So now it's complaining about the is valid, right? It's saying console log is valid is throwing an error, right? Well, what's the error? It's a reference error. It's saying that is valid is not defined. And that's because I created this variable inside of the scope of this if statement. So it only makes sense inside of this if statement. If I moved this console log up, right, and I printed in here, well, first I got to make sure that class is over set to true, just so that we can get inside of this if statement, right? Now that I have this kind of running that way, right, clearly it's console logging true, right? From the is valid console log here. So that's what I was trying to explain between the difference between var and let is that if this var was still there, I'm pretty sure that we would still be able to make reference to this value, and clearly we are, right? I'm still able to console log the is valid. But if I change that to a let, things a different story. So that's the big difference, is that between lets and vars. And so I just wanted to make that point clear. But the big point that I'm trying to make here is that we normally use let variable keywords. So you're going to want to just get familiar with that and just know that that's one of the restrictions, is that you can't reference values that are inside of a different scope with a let value. So that's just a no-no in JavaScript. But point is, we're talking not about that right now. I just want to bring that up, but we're talking about conditionals. And so here's a simple if statement. We got the if something is equal to something else, do something, right? So that's kind of how this works, right? And this would be like if some condition, and then if so, do that, right? I can make an else statement same way. And with else statements, you don't really have a condition, right? Because it's like if this or this, and then do something else, right? So this is what a typical kind of if else block would look like in JavaScript. One of the cool things about VS Code is, I don't know if you noticed, but every time I typed if, it comes up with it, like, it tries to help you out with some of the code. So there's like anything with this like kind of block looking thing right here is like a code block. So there's one for if else's that you can just really easily click and it just fills it out for you. So when it comes to conditionals, right, those are just Boolean expressions. So things like, greater than or less than returns a true or false, or things like, is this thing something like a message, returns true or false, right? So Boolean conditions are really important to know. So some of the most important ones that you're going to want to get familiar with are clearly the checking the equality of two things. And so you saw me do that with regard to class over, right? I said, is class over equal to true? So in JavaScript, we can use the double equal signs. If I wanted to check something different, like maybe like first name, equal Cam, right? So same thing, checking the equality of two things. I could also use like more mathematical Boolean values. So if I did like 50 is less than, X or something, right? The same thing, right? Each of those statements would return some type of true or false value. So technically what this would look like is if true, do this, or if false, do this. otherwise do something else. So that's really what the conditional system is. And in JavaScript, another thing that might be tricky is understanding kind of the differences between double equal signs, and in JavaScript we have triple equal signs, which the triple equal sign basically is like this. It's like 3 equal signs, and basically the difference between the double equal sign and the triple equal sign is that in JavaScript, the triple equal sign is doing a strict equality comparison. So it's making sure not only that the two values are the same, but they are also of the same type. So this is a string and this is a string. And so making sure that those objects are the same in that sense. So when it comes to like, when it comes to certain comparisons, you might see people using the triple equal sign, and that's them checking not only that the values are the same, but the type of these two objects are the same as well. But for the most part, double equal sign is fine based on the types of comparisons that you might be doing as well. So that's just important to know, because you see that sometimes and it'd be like throwing people off for stuff. Conditionals. And yeah, conditionals are mad important. These blocks really seem simple, ifs and elses and whatever, but that logic and that part of like doing something based on something and doing something else based on something else comes in handy a lot, especially with front-end programming and React and stuff like that, which we'll talk a lot about within the React context some other time. Let's see. So then last little things to talk about with regards to kind of just like an introduction to like the basic stuff you need to know in JavaScript before you kind of can get dangerous and start messing around with stuff, right? Loops, right? So loops are pretty important. And even before I talk about, before I touch on loops, I think it's important to talk about different collections in JavaScript. So one of the big ones that you probably are familiar with are arrays. And arrays are collections that let you store a list of data in a sequential order, right? So in JavaScript, we can really easily create a new array by using this syntax, open brackets, square brackets, and inside of those square brackets, you can put your list of data. So if I want numbers, I could do 1, 2, 3. If I want strings, I could do, string. Right. And JavaScript get a little tricky. I'm not going to show y'all that because I don't want to confuse it too quick. I just want to talk about the point of JavaScript. So you can choose what values are inside of your array by just ordering it that way. And arrays in JavaScript are mutable, meaning that you can add to arrays even after you've initialized it, right? So here, let's just console log this array. And clear the terminal real quick. All right, so got my array kind of coming back. And so again, like I said, I could have this be numbers and, same thing. Right. And then here's where it kind of gets interesting. Right? JavaScript kind of crazy. You know what I'm saying? JavaScript ain't the language that you might be used to, right? Like, most programming languages wouldn't let you do so like that. This is peak crackhead coding behavior. You know what I'm saying? Like, what is this? You know what I'm saying? But JavaScript be like that. That's just kind of how it is. So this is one of the reasons why things like TypeScript, people really like the idea of typing things. So instead of having an array that a random other object can be in this and not give you an error, if this was a typed scenario, this might be an array of only numbers, and then you could get an error if this happened, right? So that's why some developers are preferring to use TypeScript. Personally, you know what I'm saying? I'm not opposed to crackhead coding behavior. So I'm like, you know, I'll just rock with go with the flow and make sure that I double check my stuff, console log what's going on and stuff. But I just wanted to show y'all that, you know, JavaScript doesn't do conventional things with throwing errors when things are not as strongly typed as you might expect. So that's just important to know. But like any array, Brianna, give me 1 second. I'll get right to your question, sis. Like any array, you can reference the values in that array, like you're kind of used to. So you can call the array as a specific with the specific variable name. And then as you might know, arrays are indexed. So each array item or element in the array has a specific index that coordinates to it or corresponds to it. So every array starts with an index at 0. So this would be the element at index 0, the element at index 1, and the element at index 2. So if I wanted to interact with any of those elements, I could use this array syntax to grab that item and then ultimately reference the value. And I realized that because these are numbers, this might make sense. So let's just change this to strings. Cool. Yeah, I'll pause right there. Brianna, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just I had a question about the array with the number and then second and then another number. Does it change the type of the entire array, like for each of the objects in the array, or were you just showing that in JavaScript the arrays don't have to be the same type?
Yeah, I was showing that JavaScript in the JavaScript array, an array can hold anything in JavaScript. The thing that it does is like puts it at a specific index. Other languages, you wouldn't be able to have strings and numbers and Booleans in the same array. That would break whatever array you were looking at. But in JavaScript, because it's not strongly typed, everything in this array is like everything in this array becomes everything in this array is still referenced in a similar fashion. It just changes the it just says it's dynamic in terms of the type. It doesn't really know, you know what I'm saying? Like, and if I add something else in there, like set a Boolean in there, let's see what happens, right? So it's not really being helpful. It's just adding different types to it, you know what I'm saying? But the array itself is just referenced like a regular array. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Thank you.
It makes sense to us, but it makes no sense in the grand scheme of, is this good behavior for a programming language? But you know,
yeah.
you know what I'm saying? You win so you lose so with JavaScript. That's just kind of how it is. But yeah, great question. Any other questions at this point? I'll feel free to take a couple questions real quick. Go ahead, Angela.
So is there like a quicker way to run the code instead of writing node.main.js?
With regards to JavaScript stuff, in this sense, no, because like in this case, we're creating a file, right? A JavaScript file. And when you're running JavaScript in like a real kind of environment, you would have JavaScript files. So we would end up putting Node to run in and of itself, like whenever we wanted the file to get run. But if you just wanted to kind of follow along with what I'm doing right now and just play around with some stuff in the JavaScript console, you can also interact with Node via the command line by just running Node in your terminal. And each of these lines now become like a more interactive, it's like running the lines line by line. So if I said like, let first name equal Cam, you know what I'm saying? Then I could like console.log, first name, stuff like that. And it's given these undefined because technically when you're running Node like this, it's similar to like running it on the browser. You don't really use variable keywords and stuff. So that's why I didn't do it this way, because I wanted to show you in a file, you know, creating variables and stuff like that. But if you were just wanting to go line by line and do stuff like, you know, like set something like y equals negative 10.302, like that line before, right? So you could do it that way. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, I forgot how to get out of this. Oh yeah, Control C. At the end of the day, that's not as helpful as writing it in a file, because you're going to end up writing it in a file anyway, and you rarely are going to be like in the console on your browser just typing random stuff in. You know what I mean? It's mostly going to come back from a file. So we always use Node or some extension of Node to run our files. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, great question, bro. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Making sense so far?
Can you just run it on the console?
Can you just run it on the console? What you mean?
Like the run tab, F5?
Oh, you can do that if you want on, like, you're saying like on like in your terminal and in your text editor, like use the shortcut. Yeah, you can do that too. Inside of some text editors, you can use the shortcut to like run your stuff, and it should work. I normally don't do that just because force of habit. I like to be specific with what I'm telling my thing to do. But yeah, I'm glad we got to that question. So arrays, boom, you know what I'm saying? And in arrays in JavaScript, one of the cool things about JavaScript is that there's a lot of built-in array functions. So if I do array dot, and the dot syntax refers to, like, you know, a class referencing something inside of it, or an object referencing something inside of it. So this array object has a set of functions already built into it that are really helpful for doing different methods. Concat clearly is a function that allows for us to add to an array, right? Filter allows us to filter through an array, right? And kind of just get specific elements back based on what it has. Find lets you find an element inside of there. Find index lets you find the index of a specific element. Include lets you check if an element exists in the array. For each is a really helpful array method that we can see in a second when we talk about loops. And length, you know, if you wanted to get the length of that array, the length is a variable on the array that allows you to kind of just get the back how long that array is. So helpful thing is JavaScript has a lot of built-in functions with regard to its collections. Cool. So next big collection that you need to know outside of arrays are what we call objects in JavaScript. And objects are the quintessential kind of JavaScript. I want to say object, but like everything in JavaScript derives from an object. So this is a really important data structure to know in JavaScript. So an object is defined. An object is defined by way of curly braces. So whereas an array has kind of square brackets, objects have like curly brackets. And so inside of these curly brackets are where you would define the keys and values of that particular object. So let me actually name this and say, let's say like user, and then give it some properties, right? So maybe one of the properties that I want to give it is, I could give it like name, and give it that like cam, ID, give it some random ID, and, you know, signed in, and say like true, right? So objects let you store just different data types in one kind of store, and give you the ability to then reference those particular items with the key. So key value pairs kind of thing, right? So if I wanted to interact with this user object, I could console log user.name, right? And the hope would be that that would return the data that we defined here. So just gonna clear, right? So clearly that's working. And we reference the object, we reference the keys inside of the object with the dot syntax. So that's where you see this dot coming from. Dot refers to inside of this user object. There's a couple different properties that I want to reference. The ones on the left side of the colon are called keys. The ones on the right side are called values, right? So key value pairs. And this is a really important concept for objects. The difference between an array and an object is that with an object, you specify the value with the name of the key. With an array, you specify the value with the index. So that's just kind of the difference between those two things. Yeah, and they have different, different utilities and different moments in different settings. And just like arrays, though, the JavaScript objects also have some functions built in. So in JavaScript, we can use object, and the object class actually has a lot of functions that, like, if I wanted to list out all of the keys for a specific object, I could do that and pass in, my particular user object. So it's not built into the actual class and built into the instance, but it is built into the class for objects. So one of the cool things about JavaScript is the fact that they have these more built-in like functions into the library that make it a little bit easier to work with certain things. So if I console log this now, whoops, gotta save it. It brings me back an array of all of the keys, right? So here's key 1, key 2, key 3, right? So object.keys gives me back those keys. So I just was trying to show you all that. But objects and arrays are derived from specific classes. So there's an array class in JavaScript, right? An array class lets you kind of create new arrays and reference certain functions for arrays, like creating an array. But when you want to shorthand and initialize something as an array, all you got to do is kind of set it equal to this open square bracket. The same thing for an object. You can just open a square curly bracket and define your object that way. So yeah, those two data structures are really important. We use arrays pretty often. We use objects really often. In JavaScript, we transmit data across the web using arrays and objects and strings and all these data types you just saw: strings, numbers, Booleans, arrays, objects. These are all the most essential JavaScript data types that are necessary to know. So if you followed along all the way to this point, you're good. That's it. That's all that you really need to know as it relates to data and variables and stuff like that. The only other thing to talk about really, are like loops. And like within loops, right, you can create different types of loops in JavaScript. So you can create a for loop really simply by it says simply, right? But something like this is a for loop, right? So we could create a new instance of a variable. We call it index, or I guess y'all might be used to for I equals 0, I less than some value, let's say 3, and then I plus, right? So this would be kind of like your typical for loop flow. And then inside of here, do something that many times, right? So this is a typical for loop in this setting. But as you saw in JavaScript, we don't normally write for loops in the traditional sense. What you'll see a lot more common is like people using arrays to do loops in this sense. So you can also do a for loop by using an array with a specific length. And there's that built-in method. So for instance, we have this array, red, blue, green, that we defined above. So this array has 3 properties in it, and I can use the array method for each in order to actually loop through this array and then do something that many times as well. The difference there is that a regular for loop, you don't need an array and you could just do something that many times. But with an array and the for each method, you actually are able to create a function that will run and also can reference that array. So this array's values as it's running as well. The difference here would be something like, I'm gonna just kind of write it and show y'all, and then and then we're gonna see. Let me say like my array. Oops, I should say index actually. So yeah, something like this would print all the index values from the from this array that many as it walked through it. Or if I wanted to just kind of run, so yeah, let me just run this so you can see what I'm talking about. So this for loop, what I'm gonna do is just inside of here, I'm just gonna console log I, so we can see that run, and then we'll talk about this one in a second. Cool. So for loop, this basically says for this variable up until it gets to this expression and becomes false, keep going, I++, right? Add 1 to I, so go from 0 to 1 to 2. And that's exactly what it does, and we console log it here. So typical for loop scenario. And then the thing I was talking about with arrays is a little different. In this sense, like you could think about what's happening here as if this for loop was then, instead of just console logging I was console logging array at I, right? So basically here, what I'm saying is create a value, and then for every instance of the array that at that index, console log it, right? And so this is exactly what this same thing is doing, which is a little easier to see or easier to read, I guess, but just written in a different way. And I guess the only difference here would be is array.length. So this built-in array function allows you to use kind of a loop for within the array versus having to write a whole for loop for it. So if we console log, oops, if we just run this code now, right, it goes through that array and it prints red, blue, and green, grabbing that value from this array that we passed in. So those array functions are really helpful, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about them. So if this part was kind of a little like, you know, that was a little crazy, like ooh, had you shook a little bit. I understand. So the last thing I want to touch on is kind of this little funky thing going on here, right? So what is this? Well, this is a function that we passed into another function. So technically the array for each just looks like this. So that might be a little easier to see. But what we ended up having to do was pass in a function to use for this or for each to call. So when you hover, one of the other cool things about VS Code is you can hover over functions that are built in, and it'll give you a description of those functions. So the array for each function takes in a callback function as a parameter. And then it also allows you to define an index for that callback function. So that callback function can get a reference to the value of the array at that particular index that it's looking at. It can also give you back the index as a number if you wanted to use that in your function as well. So this thing that we're seeing, this really funky thing right here, is we're passing a function, an anonymous function, into this JavaScript function. And functions in JavaScript are not too crazy. There's two ways that you'll see people defining functions. One is using the function keyword, where you just kind of have function, the name of the function, and any params that it takes in, and you kind of just define it like that, right? And then the other is called an arrow function. And arrow functions are a little newer in JavaScript, and for the most part, we'll be writing our functions as arrow functions, but it kind of looks like this, right? So similar, more similar to this thing that you saw me write earlier. So the difference between a regular function, an old function, and an arrow function is really kind of slight right now, except that in this case, this is a variable that is referencing a function, whereas this is a function as an object, right? So this is, that's a kind of slight difference there. And then also clearly in the syntax of how you write it, there's a little difference there as well. So if I wanted to pass params in an arrow function, it looks something like that. So functions are really important, right? Because we can use those to write code that does very specific things. So in this case, maybe I want to print element, right? And I want to print the element of an array. So given a specific element that gets passed into this function, I just want to print it, right? So something like that. And this function is this function then would, you know, if I wanted to just like print something, I could call it and say print element and pass in anything, right? I could pass in like let's say array 0, right? Let me just make sure I just comment out some of these console logs. So I made my own function called print element that'll take in some param called an element and then just print it. So I called it here and passed in array at 0. And then I'm just gonna run this one more time. Right, and so this is just taking that array element at 0 and it's printing it, right? It takes that element array bracket 0 and it just prints it. So that function is pretty simple, right? And so essentially what we were doing above with this array for each and this kind of funky syntax was, instead of having to define this function separately, we were defining that function inside of the for each function, if you see what I'm saying now, because this is its own function and we were just kind of passing it as a variable, passing it into that function that directly like that. But hopefully you can see it's the same kind of thing. Technically, if I call this element and console log element, it is the exact same thing, or this part is the exact same thing as this. So yeah, those are functions in JavaScript. And we're going to talk a lot more about functions and stuff on Tuesday and start kind of playing around with JavaScript in a more practical context. I just wanted to kind of give you a primer on like some of the most important things to know. So just as a review, we talked about printing using console log, talk about variables, and we use the let keyword for the most part. Sometimes we use constants if we want to be cool like that. There's a couple different data types: numbers, strings, and Booleans, right? Strings use single or double quotes, Booleans, true or false. Conditionals, we can use if-else statements using those Boolean expressions. And there's different data structures in JavaScript related to, just different collections, excuse me, that you can use in JavaScript, like arrays that list these elements in a sequence. So from 0, 1, and 2, and then objects that store data with key value pairs. So you can set a key and the key and gets a coordinating value, and then you reference that particular key to get back the data. Like here we see user.signedin is going to reference this value here. Then we just touched on a little bit of loops. So we saw a for loop. While loops also exist in JavaScript. So a while loop is just this simple: while some condition, like while x is equal to true or something like that. This would run for until x was not equal to true, right? Then you can run some code here. So while loops also exist and are helpful in JavaScript as well. And yeah, then we touched on like arrays. Arrays have specific functions built into them. So one of the helpful ones for an array is the for each function that lets you do a loop through an array very easily. You can pass in a function to that function and then do something for every element in an array. Here you can, this name, and we'll touch on this a little next time when we talk about functions, is this name is kind of it's irrelevant. This is just the name that we gave this for each function as the callback function. So like I said, the for each callback function expects you to pass a function in, and that function receives as parameters internally a value, an index, and array. So I can reference the value with this variable. I can reference the index with another variable, and I can reference the array with another variable. So these are just variables passed. These are just, you can write whatever you want as the variable name, but these get filled by way of the for each function automatically for you. So I could have called this element, I could have called this E, I could have called this JZ, you know what I'm saying? I could have done whatever I wanted to call this, but I chose to be politically correct and call this element. But yeah, array functions are really helpful. We're gonna talk a lot about those. Regular function syntax is here, but it's kind of just like the var keyword. Function keyword was like the old way that we kind of write functions in JavaScript. We don't really do this anymore. So what you're going to see a lot of, you're going to see this a little bit in React, like the function keyword, but for the most part, we're going to write our functions as arrow functions because it just saves time and helps us with some smaller things later to just make our lives easier when we're working with React. But yeah, if all this made sense, congratulations. This is a lot to kind of take in one day of learning all the fundamentals of JavaScript. My recommendation is if you are interested to keep continuing this, definitely take a look at the Free Code Academy in JavaScript. That's really helpful and kind of goes over the same stuff in more practical context. The W3 Schools JavaScript lessons are really good and also free and make good use of stuff. And we'll talk about the W3 Schools probably in a little bit, but yeah, keep hacking on some JavaScript. Now you know how to write files, you know how to open them in VS Code, you know how to use Node to run those specific files. And that's basically all we do. Everything else from here is just us making these files a little bit more complicated and sophisticated. And but we do the same process of running Node to run the file and seeing the output. So congratulations on writing your first bit of JavaScript. I hope y'all are excited to keep going with it and look forward to more.